I never thought of myself as the kind of person things happen to. That sounds like an odd thing to say, given everything. But it's true. I was a teacher. I taught ninth grade physical science at Heir Station Secondary, which is a fancy name for a converted cargo bay with 32 desks bolted into a grid and a whiteboard that still smelled like machine oil on hot days. My students were the children of dock workers, transit administrators, customs brokers, and the occasional diplomatic aide who'd been posted out here and had no idea where else to send a 14-year-old. Heir Station sat at the edge of dragon-held space, which is a geographic designation that sounds mythic and grandiose, until you've lived there long enough to know that it mostly means the water recyclers are older than your parents. The transit delays are chronic, and every third storefront has a sign in 2 scripts, standard and draconic. I had been there 6 years when Kalos disappeared. I want to be precise about that word, disappeared, not left, not walked away, not went back, disappeared. Because when I woke up on the morning of the 14th of November and found his side of the sleeping platform cold, I did not immediately understand what had happened. I lay there for several minutes listening to the ventilation system cycle through its morning chorus, the deep hiss, the low knock, the settling groan that was always 20 minutes after lights on, and I told myself he had gone to get water. He did that sometimes on nights when the pain was bad and he didn't want to wake me. He would slip out, go down to the galley, come back with 2 cups. His hands would be cold when he set mine on the edge of the platform. He never explained and I never asked. That was the nature of us in the beginning, questions withheld, answers not required. The space where he had been still held the faint warmth of it. His biology ran warmer than mine even in sleep, and in the early years, before I understood anything about what he was, I had thought of it as one of the minor practical benefits of cohabitation, the way a person thinks about shared utilities or the convenience of someone else taking the early shift with the recycler. Later I understood it differently. Later I understood that the warmth was not incidental, that it cost him something to be cold, in a way that went beyond comfort, and that the 6 years of the thermostat set 2 degrees above my preference was not a small concession I had made but a thing that had, in ways I was still working out, mattered. I found the journal on the table. It was a small thing, bound in something that looked like leather but wasn't, a deep charcoal gray with a faint iridescent sheen that shifted green-blue when the overhead light caught it at an angle. I had seen it before, tucked under the edge of the sleeping platform or slid beneath the spare blanket in the cabinet above the galley. I had never touched it. He had never hidden it from me exactly, but he had never offered it either, and I had learned over 6 years that Kalos communicated what he wanted to communicate in his own time and on his own terms. Pressing him accomplished nothing except a longer silence and the particular quality of stillness he could achieve that made a room feel smaller. I picked up the journal. The script inside was draconic, proper draconic, not the simplified trade notation they used on the storefront signs, but the old formal register, the kind you saw occasionally in the deeper embassy corridors or on the ceremonial plaques above the consulate entrance on level 4. I had learned enough of the trade notation to navigate the market and read a cargo manifest. This was far beyond that. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you understand almost none of them. The characters long and articulated, wound through with secondary marks that I suspected carried tonal or emotional weight I could not decode. There were pages of it. Dozens of pages, filled front to back in a hand that was precise and very controlled at the start, and then, toward the middle, something that looked like urgency. The pen strokes or whatever the equivalent was, the stylus impressions pressed deeper into the material. The characters were still formed correctly, still had the discipline of someone who had been taught the script properly and maintained that discipline even in distress, but the spacing between them changed. Tighter, as though something was running out. I set it down. I went to the galley and filled a cup of water and stood there drinking it slowly, looking at the space where he usually sat in the mornings. He liked to sit with his back to the wall and his legs drawn up, watching the transit lane through the port window. He would eat whatever I put in front of him without complaint, not with enthusiasm but without complaint. In the early months, that had been the most significant thing about him, the absence of complaint. He was in pain most of the time, or something adjacent to pain, something that manifested as a faint tension around the eyes and the set of his jaw, and the way he sometimes braced one hand flat against the table, as though steadying himself against a current no one else could feel. He never named it. I never asked. I had met him in the transit processing center. This is where the detectives looked at me strangely, the first time I told them the story. 2 of them came to my door 4 days after I reported him missing. A woman named Savitz who carried herself like someone who had been tired for a long time and had made peace with it, and a man named Miguel who wrote everything down in a physical notebook with a pen, which I found disarming in a specific way I have never been able to fully explain. They sat across from me in the narrow common space and asked me to describe how Carlos and I had met, and I told them. The Transit Processing Center on Harrow Station handles both human passengers and non-human travelers, which sounds straightforward until you've stood in the queue and watched how it actually works. There are separate lanes for registered diplomatic personnel, cargo-adjacent contractors, long-stay residents, and what the signage euphemistically calls unclassified arrivals. The unclassified lane is the longest. It doubles back on itself twice. The beings in it look like they have been in lines for a long time before this one. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that transit queues produce, different from travel exhaustion or work exhaustion, a wearing down of the expectation that the situation will resolve in a reasonable time frame. The unclassified lane had that quality concentrated. I was there to re-register my residential status. It was a routine errand. I had done it twice before. The clerk who handled my paperwork was slow and methodical, in a way I had come to respect and also find slightly maddening. And when he was finally done with me, I was turning to leave and I nearly stepped on Carlos. He was in the unclassified lane. He was seated on the floor, not collapsed, not unconscious, but deliberately seated, back against the partition wall, knees up. He was small. That was the first thing. Not small the way a child is small, but compact in the way that suggested the size was chosen rather than given, if that makes any sense. I learned later that it did make sense in a way that was more literal than I'd intended. He wore a long wrap of some dark material that was doing its best to conceal the fact that his left side was injured. I could see the edge of something dark, encrusted through a gap in the wrap that his posture had opened. I asked him if he needed medical assistance. He looked up at me. His eyes were very dark, with a faint luminous quality around the iris that I later learned was characteristic of his people in low affect states. Not distress, not threat display, simply the baseline way their visual system worked, the way a cat's eyes will catch light in the dark not because the cat is afraid but because that is how the eye is made. He looked at me for a long moment with that steady, cataloging regard. Then he said in standard, "I will be seen to in time." His standard was precise, not accented in any way I could place. Just very careful, like a person using a tool they have trained with rather than one they grew up with. Each word placed where it needed to go without extras. I said, "You're bleeding through." He looked down at the gap in his wrap. He did not seem alarmed. He pressed the material back into place with one hand and looked up at me again and said, "I am aware." I don't know exactly why I stayed. I was not by nature someone who inserted herself into strangers' situations. I was a teacher. I kept my classroom in order. I showed up where I was supposed to be. I had a small, organized life on a mid-range transit station at the edge of a territorial boundary that most people in the inner systems couldn't have found on a map. I was not given to impulsive decisions. I was not given to much that would make a good story if I'm being straightforward about it. I paid attention and I showed up and I did the work in front of me. That was most of it. But I sat down on the floor next to him, which is not something the transit processing center encourages, and I waited with him. We did not speak much. At some point I went and got 2 cups of the hot grain broth they sold from the dispensary at the end of the unclassified corridor, the cheap kind, the kind that tasted more or less like warm water with ambitions, and I gave one to him and he took it with both hands and held it, and after a moment he drank some of it. He did not thank me. I did not expect thanks. I drank my own and we sat there in the queue together until his number was called. He passed through processing. I went home. He appeared at my door 11 days later. He said, "I do not have current residents. I was told this building has available units." I told him the building did have an available unit, the one across the corridor from mine, which had been empty since the Vasquez family transferred out 3 months prior. He moved into it that evening with no visible possessions except the journal and a small sealed case I never saw him open. This lasted about 6 weeks before the arrangement shifted. I don't know how to describe the shift except to say that it was gradual and mutual, and neither of us named it while it was happening. He was still in pain. I cooked in quantities large enough for 2 without being asked. He appeared at mealtimes. He slept in the chair in my common space for a while, weeks, possibly months, before that changed too. The chair was near the thermostat. I noticed he positioned himself near the thermostat. I turned it up. Neither of us discussed it. By the time I would have called him my partner, if someone had pressed me, we had already been whatever we were for long enough that the word felt like a formality applied after the fact. I told all of this to Detective Savides and Detective Miguel. Miguel filled 4 pages. Savides watched me with an expression that was calibrated, I thought, to be neutral but contained more than she was showing. She had the look of someone who had done this long enough to understand that the most important information in an interview was not usually what the person thought they were providing. "And his species registration?" Savides asked. I told her I didn't know his species registration. I had never asked. I had assumed, and I understood, telling this to an investigator, how that sounded. I had assumed he was some variety of dragon adjacent, because of the eyes and the scales along the back of his forearms and the way cold affected him. He disliked cold the way that cold was a personal insult. I kept the unit warmer than I would have preferred for 6 years without either of us mentioning it. Savides and Miguel exchanged a look. "He had scales," Miguel said. "On the forearms. And at the base of the neck. Small, dark green-black with the same iridescent quality as the journal cover." They exchanged another look. I noticed that Savides had not written anything down in the last several minutes. "Miss Sale," she said finally, "we're going to need you to remain available. Do you have somewhere you need to be in the next several days?" I told her I had a classroom to run. She said, of course, in a way that suggested the classroom was not her primary concern. They left. I stood in my common space looking at the port window and the transit lane beyond it, where a Dragon Registry freighter was making its slow way toward the docking ring. Its hull was deep red, with the scaled plating they use on the long-haul vessels, not decorative, actually functional, some kind of thermal regulation system the engineers on the inner systems had been trying to reverse engineer for 30 years. In the late morning light, the hull seemed almost warm, almost alive. I had looked at those hulls 1,000 times from that window and never thought about it. I thought about it now. I thought about the morning 2 winters ago when Carlos had come to breakfast and I had noticed, for the first time, that one of the scales on his left forearm was missing. Not damaged. Missing, the way a scale comes out at the root when the tissue beneath it is compromised. He sat down and I put a bowl of soup in front of him. Real soup that time, not the dispensary broth. A bone broth I'd learned to make from the Draconicron market on level 2, where the vendor who handled the bones always set aside a particular cut when I came on Fridays without my asking, because he had apparently noticed I came every Friday and always bought the same thing. And Carlos looked at it, and then at me, and something passed across his face that I did not have a word for. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Something that had been waiting a long time to be in the same room as a bowl of soup set down without ceremony. I went back to work. I taught 3 sections that week, 2 of them physical science, one of them a remedial math course I'd picked up when the regular instructor went on medical leave and no one else volunteered. My students were not particularly interested in physics that week. The older ones had noticed that there were new arrivals at the station, Dragon Registry vessels that were not cargo ships. There were 4 of them in the docking ring. 3 more visible in the transit lane, holding position in a way that was technically permitted and practically unprecedented. In the 12 years Harrow Station had been operating as a border transit point, 7 Dragon hierarchy vessels had never held stations simultaneously in the transit lane without prior diplomatic notification. My students wanted to talk about it. I told them to open their workbooks. After the last session, I went to the administrative office and looked up what I could. The vessels were registered to the Dragon hierarchy's envoy corps. Not ambassadorial. The ambassadorial vessels were different, smaller, and they came through regularly on scheduled rotations. The envoy corps designation was something else. Envoy corps was what the Dragon hierarchy deployed when something had happened that required management at the highest level. Not negotiation, not trade, not the ordinary diplomacy of borders and protocols, but the kind of presence that announced, "This matter belongs to us and we are here." I thought about the journal on my table. I thought about the scales on his forearms, small and dark and iridescent. I thought about the way he held a hot cup with both hands. I thought about the look on his face over the bone broth 2 winters ago, the thing I had not had a word for. I went home and I picked up the journal. I know enough of the trade notation Draconic to recognize about 30 characters, maybe 40 if I'm being generous. The formal register uses something like 400 base characters with variant forms. I sat at the table with the journal open and a notation guide pulled up on my screen, and I made essentially no progress for 2 hours. What I could tell, the journal was not, or not only, a personal record. The structure was different from what I would have expected from a diary. There were lists. I could recognize the list format by the indentation and the repeated structural character at the left margin. There were what looked like calculations, or at minimum something that organized itself the way calculations do, columns and subcolumns, and what appeared to be date markers at the top of each section. And there were passages that were clearly narrative, long paragraphs of the tight, formal, draconic hand that flowed across pages without breaking, that had the rhythm, even untranslated, of a person telling something important to someone who matters. There was one word I recognized. It appeared 12 times that I could count, and possibly more in forms I didn't catch. I had seen it on the consulate plaque on level 4, and once in a transit briefing document that had been imperfectly redacted, the kind of redaction where the word is blacked out, but the context around it makes the word legible anyway. In the trade notation, it would be rendered approximately as the sound the word makes in formal standard transliteration, something like Varath, a hard V and a breath at the end, the kind of word that takes up more space in the mouth than its 2 syllables suggest. In the formal register, the character was more complex, wound through with the secondary marks, but I recognized its core component. In standard, the closest translation was emperor. I closed the journal. I made dinner. I sat and ate it alone. I washed the bowl and the cup and put them away in the right places, the same places they always went, and I stood at the port window and watched the transit lane, where the envoy corps vessels still held their positions like very large, very patient stones. The station lighting in the transit lane was calibrated for visibility across a range of hull colors and surface types, and on the envoy corps vessels, it caught the scale plating the way sunlight catches the surface of deep water, not reflecting cleanly, but shifting, throwing back something that was related to the light source without being identical to it. I went to the embassy on level for the next morning before school. The woman at the front desk, a human woman which surprised me slightly, though it shouldn't have. The dragon hierarchy employed humans at most of their human-facing administrative positions, told me that the embassy did not handle missing persons inquiries, and that I should contact station security. I told her I had already contacted station security. She told me that she understood and that she was not in a position to assist me further. I told her I had a journal written in formal Draconic that I believed was relevant to the current Envoy Corps deployment, and I set the journal on her desk. The quality of silence in the embassy lobby changed. The woman at the desk looked at the journal without touching it. I watched something move behind her careful professional composure, not panic, something more controlled than panic, the movement of a person who has just recognized that they are in a situation their training covered, but that they did not expect to encounter personally. She said, "Please wait here," and went through the door behind her and did not return for approximately 20 minutes. When the door opened again, it was not her. It was a dragonkind being in the diplomatic attire of a senior attaché, scaled humanoid, tall, with the formal wing-folding posture that indicated, I had learned from 6 years on a border station, that they were deliberately presenting non-threat. He looked at me and then at the journal on the desk and then at me again. His eyes had the luminous quality in the iris, the same family as Carlos's, banked and steady. He said, in formal standard, far more formal than Carlos's careful, precise speech, the kind of formal that felt like a structure you were meant to notice, that drew attention to itself as deliberate. "Where did you obtain this?" I said it had been left in my home by someone who had lived with me for 6 years. He said, "And where is this person now?" I said that was what I was trying to find out. He said something I didn't catch, not in standard, in Draconic, addressed not to me but to someone behind the door he had come through. Then he looked at me and said, "You will give us your contact information. We will be in contact." He reached for the journal. I picked it up. He went very still. I said, "I'll keep this for now. When you have information about where Carlos is, I'll be happy to sit down with whoever you need me to sit down with." I put the journal in my bag and I left. I don't know where that came from. I am not, as I said, given to impulsive decisions. I am not brave in any way that I would call structural or reliable. But the journal was the only thing I had of him, and I was not going to hand it to a stranger in diplomatic attire who had looked at it the way you look at something you intend to take. Detective Savides called me that afternoon. She said, "Ms. Sale, I need to ask you something directly. Did Carlos ever tell you who he was?" I said no. She said, "Did he ever give you a family name, a lineage designation? Anything beyond Carlos?" I said he had given me only Carlos. I had assumed it was a use name. Dragonkind often used simplified names for human contact situations, the way a person might use a shortened version of their name in a professional context where the full form would be unfamiliar. I had not pushed on it because I had not needed to call him anything other than Carlos in 6 years, and the question had never pressed itself urgently enough to ask. Savides was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing and what sounded like the particular ambient quality of a station security office, the low background hum of a space that runs continuously. Then she said, "The Envoy Corps contacted station security this morning. They've requested access to you as a material witness." I said, "Witness to what?" She said, "We're still working that out. I want you to know that station security will not compel your cooperation with the Envoy Corps without your consent, and you are not under investigation for anything. You're not a suspect. You've reported a missing person. You are entitled to handle this in the ordinary way." I thanked her. I asked whether she had found anything. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, There was a medical facility flag on a transit record connected to his registration. It may be nothing. These flags can come from routine medical intake from years ago. I asked which medical facility. She said she couldn't share that information. I thanked her again and ended the call. I knew the medical facilities on Heir Station. There were 3. The main one on level 2, which handled the bulk of human and some non-human care. The specialist clinic on level 5, which was primarily for diplomatic personnel and had a small non-human wing with the kind of discreet intake process that the hierarchy's people preferred, and the quarantine bay on level 7. The quarantine bay on level 7 was not publicly listed. You would not find it on the station directory. It existed because Heir Station, as a border transit point, occasionally received beings who were compromised in ways that complicated ordinary processing, medical situations that intersected with legal or diplomatic status, conditions that required isolation protocols that the other facilities were not equipped for. It was understaffed and deliberately low profile, and it operated at the edge of several regulatory classifications simultaneously, which meant that in practice it had a level of discretion built into its function that the other facilities, with their logs and their intake forms and their publicly accessible registries, could not afford. I knew it existed because one of my students 2 years ago had a parent who worked there, and the parent had mentioned it at a school conference in the way that people mention things they assume are already known, as context rather than revelation. I went to level 7 after school. The quarantine bay was behind a service corridor access that required a badge I did not have. I stood at the door for a while thinking about this in a practical, sequential way. Then I went back to the main corridor and found the supply station near the freight elevator, where the dock crews left their maintenance-coded access badges in the unlocked rack. This was a lapse in station security that I had been passively aware of for years, the kind of thing you file in the background part of your mind under "not my problem," and I used one of the badges to open the door and went through. The quarantine bay was low lit, not dim in a dramatic way, just conservative. The lighting ran on a different schedule from the rest of the station, calibrated for beings who found the standard overhead strip lighting physiologically uncomfortable. There were 6 bays along one wall, separated by translucent partitions that were opaque enough for privacy and transparent enough to allow visual monitoring from the central station. 5 were empty. In the 6th, there was a being on the platform. It was Carlos. He was on his side, facing the wall, curled in the way I had seen him curl on particularly bad nights. The wing analog structures along his shoulder blades pulled up and in and over himself in what I had thought for years was a protective sleep posture, and now understood, looking at it clearly for the first time in this low, honest light, was something else. It was the posture of something trying to be smaller than it was, containing itself, making itself as compact as possible, not for warmth but for, I thought about it, for the management of something that would otherwise be visible. He was scaled from shoulder to heel. I had known about the forearms. I had known about the base of the neck. I had not known about the rest. The scales were deep green-black, iridescent in the low light, catching the overhead strips in the same shifting way the Envoy Corps hulls caught the transit lane lighting. Along the ridge of his spine they were larger, not integumental but structural, the kind of scale that in full-grown dragonkind I had seen represented in biology diagrams served actual armor function. He was breathing. Slow and careful and deliberate, the breathing of something in controlled pain that has had a long time to get good at controlling pain. I went to him. I sat on the edge of the platform. He did not move. I put my hand on the scales between his shoulder blades the way I had done on those bad nights when I heard the sound of him bracing against the table in the dark. Not carefully, not tentatively, just the flat of my palm against the warmth of him, which was always warmer than I expected even when he seemed cold. He said without turning, "How did you get in here?" I said, "Supply badge from the freight elevator rack." He was quiet, then he said, "You should not be here." I said, "You left your journal on my table." A long silence. The ventilation in the quarantine bay had a different sound than the rest of the station, deeper, slower, more deliberate, like breathing that had been tuned to a specific rhythm. He turned, carefully, with the particular negotiation of movement that I had watched for 6 years, and understood now in a way I had not before. Every position change was a calculation of cost and benefit, and the choice to face me had just been weighed and made. He looked at me. His eyes in the low light had the luminous quality around the iris at a register I had not seen before, brighter than the baseline, and with a quality of exposure in it, the way a light appears brighter when the surrounding space is darker. He looked older than I had ever seen him look. Not in years, in something else. Depth, maybe. Weight. The specific quality of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time, and is aware, in this moment, that the carrying may be coming to an end, one way or another. "You read it," he said. I told him I'd tried. I said I'd gotten about 30 characters in before my limitations became obvious. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The adjacent thing, the thing that lived in the neighborhood of a smile without being one. I said, "You could have told me." He said, "Told you what?" I said, "Whatever is in that journal. Whatever brought you to this station 6 years ago in the unclassified queue with a wound in your side. Whatever is waiting for you out in the transit lane with 7 envoy corps vessels." He looked at the port window. The quarantine bay had a narrow port window, long and horizontal near the ceiling, and through it I could see a section of the transit lane and the edge of one of the envoy corps vessels. Even the edge of it was large. Even the edge of it had the carved-looking hull plating that their formal vessels used, the overlapping scale forms that made the whole surface look like the side of something living rather than something built. He said, "I came to this station because it was far enough from the court that I could be ill in private." I said, "And am I part of the private?" Another silence. Then, "Yes, you were from the beginning. You were the part of this that was mine, not the courts, not the hierarchies, not the successions, mine." I had spent 6 years with this man, being person, whatever the right word was, and I had turned that question over in the background of my mind more times than I could count, and had never arrived at an answer I was fully satisfied with, and had also decided that I did not require a fully satisfying answer, that the question was less important than the fact of him sitting across the table in the mornings with his back to the wall and his legs drawn up, watching the transit lane. I had fed him soup and slept next to him and kept the unit warm enough for his biology and asked fewer questions than most people would have thought was reasonable. And I had understood, in the way you understand things that you choose not to put into language, that he was keeping a distance between us that was not emotional but structural. Something he carried that I was not permitted to share. I had respected it. I had, without naming it, decided that whatever he was carrying was his, and that my job, if I had a job, was to set a bowl of soup down without making it a question. "Tell me now," I said. He looked at me for a long time. The luminous quality around his irises shifted slightly. I had catalogued these shifts over the years without understanding them, the way a person who lives with weather learns to read the sky not through any formal system, but through accumulated observation. This one I associated with something I had always read as vulnerability, but now thought might be something more specific. Capitulation, maybe. The decision to stop holding something that had become too heavy to hold. He told me. His father was the Dragon Emperor. He was the only surviving heir. There had been others, 3 siblings, but they were gone in ways he described briefly, and with a flatness that suggested the flatness was doing a great deal of work, that beneath it was something he had spent a long time not looking at directly. He had been ill since before he came to the station. a progressive failure in the deep structure tissue that ran under the spinal scales, a condition that in his species was almost always terminal, and that the dragon hierarchy's court physicians had, over the course of several years, with considerable resources and genuine effort, failed to arrest. He had come to Harrow Station to die in a place where the court could not watch him die, because the watching would have required ceremony, and ceremony would have required decisions about succession that he was not willing to force, while there was still a possibility he was wrong about how this ended. I listened. I did not say anything. He said his father had known where he was for most of the 6 years. Not immediately. For the first year, he said, the court had believed he was dead, which had created its own crisis that he described with a brevity that told me the crisis had been significant. Then they had found him, through means he did not specify, but that I inferred involved the kind of intelligence resources that an empire deploys when it is looking for something important. His father had chosen not to compel his return. He did not say why. He said only, "My father let me have it." The 7 vessels in the transit lane represented a recent escalation. The emperor was dying himself, faster than expected, and the court needed the heir or needed the heir's confirmed death, because without one or the other they could not manage succession in a way that would hold. I said, "And the journal?" He said the journal was his account. Everything. The illness. The station. The years. Written for his father, who would never read it in the sense of reading as understanding. His father's vision had been failing for 2 years, and reading was done for him now by his senior chamberlain, but written as a record that his father could have read to him. An account that could be known if not seen. He said, "I left it for you because I did not want to leave without leaving something. I did not have another way to do it. I could not write it in standard. The account isn't meant for standard. It's meant for what it is." I sat with that for a while. The ventilation cycled. The low, steady sound of it filled the space between us. I said, "What happens when the envoy corps comes in here?" He said, "They take me back. There will be a proceeding. If I am declared unfit to succeed, which I am, there will be a succession crisis. It will be managed. These things are always managed." He said it without bitterness, which was more affecting than bitterness would have been. I said, "And if they decide you're not unfit?" He looked at me. He said, "They will not decide that." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I have not presented myself to the court in 6 years. Because I have been living in a residential unit on a border transit station with a human teacher, and eating her soup and sleeping in her chair, and setting my back to walls in the mornings to watch the transit lane. Because whatever I am now, I am not what an emperor's heir is supposed to be." I said, "What are you now?" He was quiet for a long time. The ventilation cycled. Outside the narrow port window, the transit lane was beginning to show the early shift change, small utility craft making their runs between the docking ring and the mid-range holding positions. A cargo release from Bay 12 that I recognized by the characteristic clunk that traveled through the hull, the sound I had been hearing for 6 years without thinking about it, and was now conscious of in a way I hadn't been before. The familiar made strange by attention. Or not strange, just seen. He said, "Alive, more than I thought I would be." There was a sound in the corridor. Not the ventilation, not the hull, footsteps, and more than 2 pairs, and the particular quality of motion that meant people who moved like that moved that way, because they had decided where they were going and expected the space to accommodate them. I stood up. He looked at me. I said, "Stay here." He said, "Mara." I said, "Stay here." I went to the door of the bay and opened it before they could open it themselves. There were 5 of them in the corridor. 3 dragonkind in the formal attire of the senior envoy rank, scaled humanoid, the wing-fold posture carrying something different from the attaché in the embassy lobby. Not the non-threat display I had seen there, but controlled momentum, the posture of people who have a destination and have calculated the efficiency of reaching it. Behind them, 2 human security personnel from station security, which told me that Savides had tried to put a procedural buffer in place, and the envoy corps had threaded through it cleanly. The lead envoy, the tallest, with the silver-white scale accent at the jaw that I understood indicated senior rank in the hierarchy's formal corps, looked at me, and then passed me at Kalos on the platform, and I watched something shift in his face at the sight of what was on that platform. He said, in standard that was formal to the point of ritual, each word a deliberate placement, "We are here for Kalos Varath, first of the Emperor's line." I said, "He's in medical care." The lead envoy said, "We are aware. We are here to transport him to the care of the hierarchy's court physicians." I said, "He hasn't consented to transport." The lead envoy looked at me with the full, careful, banked regard of his species. His eyes had the luminous quality, the same family as Kalos's, older and more controlled, the light in them settled rather than shifting. He said, "This does not require his consent. The court has authority over the first of the line in all matters of succession and health. This is not disputed." I said, "Then you'll need to go through station security's process, and station security has a procedure for disputed medical transport of non-human residents in active residency status, and I am his registered cohabitant under border station residential law, which gives me standing in that procedure. So if you want to take him, you'll go through the procedure." This was a bluff of extraordinary ambition. I was not certain any of it was true. I was fairly certain that some of it was true. The cohabitant registration was real. I had filed it in the second year when it became relevant for some administrative purpose I had already forgotten, and that the rest of it was at least the right shape of true, which is sometimes sufficient. The shape of true is often enough to require verification before anyone acts, and verification takes time, and time is what I needed. The lead envoy was very still. The 2 station security officers behind the envoy team were also very still, but in a different way, in the way of people who have been caught between 2 forces and are urgently hoping not to be asked to choose a side. The lead envoy said, "You are his cohabitant." I said, "For 6 years." He said, "You are human." I said, "Yes." He said nothing for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet. Then he said in Draconic, and I did not understand it, but I felt the shape of it change the air around it, the way very precise language in any register changes the room it's spoken in, something that I would later have translated for me as, "The Emperor's heir has been kept in a human's care, on a border station, eating from her hands, for 6 years." And the second envoy said something back, quiet and direct, which was, "And he is alive." There was a silence that lasted long enough for the ventilation to cycle once. Long enough for the utility craft visible through the far end of the corridor's port-side windows to complete their slow arc from the docking ring toward the mid-range holding positions. Then the lead envoy looked at me and said, very precisely, "We will follow the procedure." I stepped back into the bay. I sat down next to Kalos on the platform. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 6 years. Not the adjacent smile thing, not the baseline luminous regard, not the careful controlled flatness he wore in public spaces. Something open, something that had been behind whatever he usually showed me, and had come to the surface without being invited, the way a thing surfaces when the weight holding it down is removed. He said very quietly, "What did you do?" I said, "I don't entirely know yet." He said, "Mara, do you understand what it means if the envoy corps acknowledges your standing? Do you understand what you have just placed yourself into?" I thought about it. I said, "Explain it to me." He said, "If you have standing in my medical transport under border station law, then you have standing in my proceedings. If you have standing in my proceedings, you are recognized as bound to me under some form of dragon hierarchy law by extension. Not formally, not in the terms the court uses for formal bonds, but close enough to formal that the envoys would have to argue against it to exclude you. and arguing against it would require them to argue that 6 years of cohabitation and care carries no weight, which would require them to argue that what you did. He stopped. He looked at the port window. What you did for 6 years, the soup, the warmth, sitting on the floor of a transit processing center with someone who had not asked you to, all of it, they would have to argue it meant nothing. And they won't. I said, why not? He said, because in dragon law, care given freely, without contract, without knowledge of rank, is the highest form of bond. There is no ceremony that outweighs it, no lineage agreement, no court proceeding. The emperor, my father, wrote that law himself. 400 years ago, when there was a dispute in the court about whether arranged bonds carried more authority than bonds formed outside the court's knowledge, he ruled that the court's knowledge was irrelevant. That care given in ignorance of rank was worth more than care given in awareness of it, because it could not be motivated by advantage. He looked at me. He said, my father wrote that law, and you have just invoked it against his own envoy corps. I sat with that for a moment. I said, you could have told me. He said, if I had told you, you would have known, and I needed, he stopped again, a long pause, long enough that I thought he might not finish it. I needed someone who didn't know, who gave the soup because I looked cold, not because they understood what it meant to give it. I needed the thing that was real, not the thing that was managed. I had given him soup because he looked cold, because it was morning and I had a pot on, and there was enough for two, and he was sitting in a transit processing center queue with a wound in his side, and the careful, precise standard of someone using a tool they had trained with rather than one they grew up with. And it was cold the way border stations are cold in November. And the dispensary broth at the end of the unclassified corridor was 2 credits and tasted like warm water with ambitions. And I had 2 credits, and he was there. I had not done it for any reason except that. I said, how bad is it? The illness. He said, 6 years ago, I would not have predicted 6 years. I looked at him. He looked at me. The low light of the quarantine bay was steady and honest in the way that honest light is. It didn't flatter anything, but it also didn't distort. I said, so whatever the court's physicians try. He said, maybe more than I had, possibly. Possibly, I said. I have been given to underestimating things, he said, historically. The procedure took 4 days. I will compress those 4 days because most of them were procedural, and the procedure was tedious to live through and would be more tedious to recount. There were forms. There were depositions. Detective Savide sat through 3 of them with the focused, calibrated attention she brought to everything, and Miguel filled approximately 37 pages of his physical notebook in his careful penmanship. The lead envoy, whose name I eventually learned was Savith, was professional in a way that felt, by the end, like the beginning of a different kind of conversation, though I could not have named precisely what kind. The court physicians arrived on the 2nd day, 3 of them, on a separate vessel, smaller and faster than the envoy corps ships, with the kind of unmarked hull plating that communicates urgency through its very blankness, the absence of marking that is itself a form of declaration. They spent approximately 18 hours in the quarantine bay with Kalos, and produced a report that I was not permitted to read in full, though I was given a summary that told me their preliminary findings were not what the court had expected. On the 4th day, I was asked to attend a formal proceeding in the embassy's level for ceremonial hall. The hall was large for Harrow Station, which is to say it was approximately the size of my classroom, with the dividing wall removed. It had been prepared in the formal dragon hierarchy style. The lighting shifted to the lower register that their high ceremony situations required. The chairs arranged in the structured arc that the hierarchy used for witness proceedings. The floor cleared of the ordinary embassy furniture, and replaced with the formal standing positions indicated by marks I could recognize from diplomatic briefing materials as the court's spatial language for events that would be part of the record. Savith stood at the center, 4 other envoys flanked him. The court physician stood at the far end. 2 station security officers stood near the door, which told me that Savides had insisted on human witnesses and had won that one. I stood in the center. Savith spoke in formal Draconic for several minutes. The acoustics of the space caught his voice in a way that the ordinary embassy lobby did not. It carried, and it had weight, and the formal register he was using had a rhythm to it that I could feel even without understanding the words, the way certain music works on a body regardless of whether the listener knows the language of the composer. Then he turned to the human translator, who rendered it. The envoy corps of the dragon hierarchy acknowledges and confirms the following: that Kalos Vareth, first of the emperor's line, has resided under the care of Mara Sale, resident of Heir Station, for a period of 6 years. That this care was given freely, without condition, without knowledge of rank, and without contract of any kind. That under Article 14 of the Emperor's Care Doctrine, the doctrine bearing the Emperor's own seal, and established in his own name 400 years prior, freely given care of this nature, extended across seasons, constitutes a bond of highest standing under dragon hierarchy law. That this bond predates the current proceedings and supersedes all procedural questions of cohabitation or residential status. That Mara Sale therefore holds recognized standing in all matters pertaining to Kalos Vareth, first of the Emperor's line, including medical, residential, and pending formal court review, succession-adjacent proceedings. The translator paused, looked at her notes, continued. Furthermore, the envoy corps acknowledges that the court physician's preliminary assessment indicates that Kalos Vareth's current condition, while serious, has shown measurable stabilization inconsistent with the projected terminal trajectory established 6 years ago. The court physicians attribute this stabilization to— She paused again, and I could see in the pause that she was reading something she had not expected to be asked to translate in a formal setting. To consistent thermal regulation, regular nutrient intake, and the physiological effects of sustained proximity to a bonded individual. The translator looked up at me. I thought about the thermostat. 6 years of setting it 2 degrees warmer than I would have preferred. 6 years of a pot of soup in the morning. 6 years of the flat of my palm on the scales between his shoulder blades in the dark. The envoy corps, Savith said then, in standard, departing from the formal Draconic, speaking directly to me. And this departure, I was told later, was itself a significant gesture, a choice that would be noted in the formal record of the proceeding as an acknowledgement of equal standing, rather than the relaying of information to a party whose standing was contingent. Requests that you accompany Kalos Vareth to the court, in whatever capacity you choose to name. The Emperor has been informed of these proceedings in full. The Emperor has requested your presence. The Emperor. He paused. The luminous quality of his eyes shifted in the particular way I had learned to associate with something that did not translate cleanly between species, something that lived in the register below formal language. The Emperor says to tell you, Savith continued, that his son has been eating soup. There was a silence in the hall. Then Savith lowered his head. Not a small gesture, not a nod, not an inclination. A full lowering the chin to the chest, the wing structures folding in, the posture that I understood from 6 years on a border station was the dragon hierarchy's formal acknowledgement bow. The 4 flanking envoys followed. The court physicians followed. The 2 station security officers near the door made no sound, but I heard Savides draw a breath that told me she was processing something she had not anticipated in this room this morning. The bow was given to a 9th grade science teacher from Heir Station who had fed someone soup because it was cold. I had kept a small, organized life for 6 years. I had taught physical science. I had set a thermostat. I had made broth from bones I bought at the Draconic market on level 2, and I had put it in front of someone without asking why, and had asked less than most people would have thought was reasonable. and he had been alive for 6 years more than he had predicted. And the court physicians had a formal term for what they believed the mechanism was, and the term was sustained proximity to a bonded individual, which is the dragon hierarchy's language for what it looks like, in physiological terms, when a person stays in a room with someone and keeps it warm. I looked at the window of the ceremonial hall. Through it, at an angle, I could see the transit lane, the 7 envoy corps vessels, the deep red of their hulls in the station's daytime lighting, the scale plating catching the light the way living things do, shifting and alive rather than fixed. I thought about what I was going to say to my students. I had left them with a substitute, a curriculum packet, and the instruction to begin the chapter on heat transfer and thermal equilibrium. It had felt at the time like a coincidence of timing. I was less certain of coincidences now, or rather I understood that what we call coincidence is often just the point at which two systems, running separately, intersect. The universe does not arrange things. It simply runs. The intersections are what they are. Heat transfer, the movement of warmth from one body to another. It is not complicated as physics goes. It does not require knowledge of the system. You do not need to know the mass or the composition or the history or the rank of the object. You only need to be present and to be warmer and to stay. I said yes. The Dragon Emperor was very ill. Not as ill as he had been in the weeks before the news reached him. There is a particular biology of grief and hope in dragonkind that the court physicians could explain in technical terms I will not reproduce here. But the simplified version is that certain things turn in a body when a reason to turn is given. He had been given a reason. The court physician's projection for him, as of the 5th day after the proceeding, was revised significantly upward. These things are not guarantees. But they are not nothing. Kalos did not die on a cold quarantine bay on a border transit station. I want to say that clearly. This is not that story. I resigned from Harrow Station Secondary at the end of the term. I wrote a letter to the school administration that was the most peculiar letter of resignation they had received in the school's 30-year history, and I have been told that it is framed in the break room, though I have not been back to verify. I suspect this is the kind of thing that becomes true in the telling regardless of whether it is true in fact, and I have made peace with that. I see Savides occasionally, when court business brings me through border transit stations that fall under her jurisdiction. She drinks her coffee the same way. She still carries herself like someone who has been tired for a long time and has made peace with it, and I mean that as the respectful observation it is. Miguel, I hear, filled more pages in the day after my departure than on any previous day in his career, which I take as a form of tribute. He sent me a copy of the transcript eventually. It ran to 62 pages. I keep it in a drawer. Kalos is not the emperor. His father is still alive, which is its own long story and one the court's physicians will be glad to tell you involves factors they are still studying. There is a succession being managed, in the way these things are managed, carefully, and over a long time, and with the enormous patience that dragonkind bring to anything they intend to get right. I am part of those proceedings in the capacity that the formal record established. I am still not entirely sure what that capacity is called, in standard. In Draconic, it has a word that the translator once told me could be rendered approximately as the one who kept the room warm, which is not a formal title, but which I have been told carries more weight in the court's understanding than most formal titles do. I can manage about 140 characters of formal Draconic now. The journal he left on my table I have read 3 times with help. It is what he said it was, an account. Everything. The illness, the station, the years, the mornings, the thermostat, the bone broth from the Friday market. There is a passage near the middle, in the section where the handwriting shifts into what I recognized as urgency, that the translator rendered for me as follows. She does not ask. She simply sets the bowl down. I don't know if she understands that this is the whole of it. I don't know if she would believe me if I told her that the warmth of this room has been, for 6 years, the only warmth I have had that did not carry a price. That did not require anything of me in return. That was simply present, the way heat is present in a room where someone has kept the temperature set to the right number without being asked. I read that passage 3 times. I still teach. Different students in a different building, in a part of the hierarchy's territory I would not have been able to name on a map 6 years ago. The building is warmer than any school I have taught in before, climate-controlled for dragonkind students, who are the majority in the upper grades, and their human classmates who have learned to shed their cardigans by October and think nothing of it. My classroom smells like warm air and dry stone, and on certain mornings when the kitchen on the floor below sends things up through the ventilation, something close enough to bone broth that I have to stand still for a moment before I can begin. My students are extraordinary in the way that students are always extraordinary when you pay attention, which is to say, they are 14, and they want to know how everything works, and they will not accept the answer that it is complicated when what they mean is that the answer is unknown. They want to understand heat transfer and gravity, and the mechanics of light bending around large objects. They want to know how the universe holds itself together. I tell them, carefully, and over a very long time, and mostly without knowing what it is doing. I tell them that the most significant forces in any system are often not the ones doing the visible work. That warmth travels by conduction, convection, radiation, contact, movement, presence across space. That you do not need to understand a system to affect it. That the smallest, most ordinary interventions can change the trajectory of very large things, given enough time, given enough patience, given the simple fact of staying. I tell them to open their workbooks. I set the thermostat 2 degrees warmer than I would prefer, and I begin.